Appalachian Mountains, West Virginia, March 1954. While most girls her age were learning to sew and cook and prepare for lives that would mirror their mothers' lives in every predictable detail, 14-year-old Clara Whitmore was climbing a rocky trail toward a hollow so remote and steep that even the most desperate coal miners had passed it by, carrying everything she owned in a flour sack and wondering if the strange sunken formation she had discovered during a forbidden exploration 2 summers earlier might be her only chance at survival. 3 days before, her grandmother had made her position clear in front of the entire family gathered for Sunday dinner, her voice carrying the cold finality of a judge delivering a sentence. This girl is more trouble than she's worth. She wanders when she should work. She reads books instead of learning useful things. She asks questions that no decent girl should ask. I've fed her for 6 years since her mother passed, and I'm done. She can find somewhere else to be a burden. No one had spoken in Clara's defense. Her aunts had studied their plates with sudden, intense interest. Her uncles had cleared their throats and said nothing. Her cousins, some of whom she had considered friends, had pretended she had already vanished from the room. In a family where grandmother's word was law, and where girls were expected to be grateful for whatever charity they received, Clara had committed the unforgivable sin of being different, of wanting more, of refusing to shrink herself small enough to fit the space they had allocated for her existence. Clara had been her grandmother's burden since she was 8 years old, when her mother had died of pneumonia in a drafty company house, while her father was working a double shift in the coal mine that would claim his life 2 years later. The mine collapse that killed Thomas Whitmore had also killed any obligation his family felt toward his daughter. Their grief for the lost son not extending to active care for the orphaned granddaughter. Clara's grandmother, Martha Whitmore, had taken her in because the alternative would have invited gossip, because neighbors would have talked if she had sent her own blood to the county orphanage, because appearances mattered more than affection in the tight-knit mountain community, where everyone knew everyone's business. For 6 years, Clara had earned her keep through constant labor, rising before dawn to help with cooking and cleaning, walking 3 miles to a school that her grandmother considered a waste of time for a girl, returning to more chores that lasted until exhaustion dropped her into dreamless sleep. She had learned early that gratitude was expected for this arrangement, that any complaint or request was met with reminders of her dependent status, that she existed in her grandmother's house on sufferance rather than welcome. What Martha Whitmore had not anticipated was that Clara would use those walks to and from school to explore the surrounding mountains, mapping the hollows and ridges in her mind, discovering places that the adults in her life had forgotten or never known existed. And what Martha had never understood was that the books Clara read in stolen moments were not idle entertainment, but survival manuals, agricultural guides, accounts of people who had built lives in impossible places through knowledge and determination. The hollow Clara had discovered 2 summers earlier lay at the end of a trail so overgrown that she had initially missed it entirely, finding the entrance only when she followed a creek upstream to its source and discovered a narrow gap between rock faces that opened into something unexpected. The hollow itself was perhaps 3 acres, surrounded by steep walls that rose 200 feet on 3 sides, open only to the south, where the creek trickled out through the gap she had entered. But the truly remarkable feature was not the hollow itself, but what lay within it. A sunken area roughly 50 feet across and 15 feet deep, perfectly circular, with walls of exposed rock that caught and held the sun's warmth in ways that the surrounding forest could not match. Clara had returned to this place a dozen times over the following months, observing how the temperature in the sunken area stayed warmer than the surrounding hollow, how the rock walls seemed to gather heat during the day and release it slowly through cold nights, how plants at the bottom of the depression stayed green weeks longer in autumn and emerged weeks earlier in spring than identical plants just yards away at normal ground level. She had read about such formations in a library book about ancient agriculture, structures called sunken gardens that civilizations in cold climates had used for thousands of years to extend growing seasons and cultivate crops that should not have survived their harsh environments. The book had described the principle in scientific terms. Cold air sinks and flows downhill like water, pooling in low areas and valleys. But a sunken garden excavated into a hillside or plateau could actually trap warm air, creating a microclimate significantly different from the surrounding landscape. Clara had found a natural version of this principle, a geological accident that had created exactly the conditions that ancient farmers had labored to construct by hand. Clara reached the hollow on the third day of walking, having traveled only at night to avoid being seen and reported to her grandmother or the county authorities, who would return her to a family that did not want her. She had eaten nothing but the small amount of cornbread she had taken when she left, and her body ached from sleeping in cold forest duff while waiting for darkness to cover her movement. But when she descended through the gap and saw the sunken garden waiting in the early morning light, its rock walls already catching the first rays of sun, she felt something that had been absent from her life for 6 years: hope. She would not die here. She would not merely survive here. She would build something here that would make everyone who had discarded her understand exactly what they had thrown away. The first weeks were brutal, testing Clara's resolve in ways she had not anticipated, despite all her reading and planning. She had no tools, except a small knife she had taken from her grandmother's kitchen. She had no food except what she could find in the still dormant early spring forest, the inner bark of certain trees that her book said was edible, early greens that emerged in sheltered spots, a few wild onions whose location she had memorized during previous explorations. She lost weight she could not afford to lose, her already thin frame becoming gaunt as she burned calories faster than she could replace them. She built a crude shelter against the rock wall of the sunken garden, using branches and bark and leaves, learning through miserable trial and error which configurations kept out rain and which funneled water directly onto her sleeping body. But she also learned the rhythms of her new home, the patterns that would eventually allow her to not just survive but thrive. She discovered that the sunken garden's rock walls held heat even more effectively than she had realized, staying warm to the touch for hours after sunset, radiating that stored warmth into the enclosed space throughout the night. She found that the hollow's southern exposure and protective walls created a microclimate warm enough to support vegetation that had no business growing at this elevation in the Appalachian Mountains. She identified a small spring that emerged from rocks at the hollow's upper end, providing water that never froze completely even in the coldest weather. and she began to plan, sketching designs in the dirt with a stick, calculating dimensions based on the measurements she paced off, envisioning a structure that would transform this natural gift into something capable of producing food year-round. The design Clara developed over those first weeks drew on everything she had read about pit greenhouses, earth-sheltered growing spaces, and the ancient agricultural techniques that pre-industrial peoples had used to cultivate crops in climates that should have been too harsh for farming. She would dig the sunken garden deeper, expanding its floor space while increasing the height of its heat-retaining walls. She would create terraced beds along the walls where different crops could receive different amounts of sun and warmth. She would cover the top with a roof that admitted light while trapping heat, creating a fully enclosed growing space that would stay warm enough for year-round production, even when temperatures outside dropped below zero. The digging began in late April, when the ground had thawed enough to work, and Clara had regained enough strength from her meager diet to attempt physical labor. She had no shovel, so she made one, finding a flat piece of shale that she could use as a blade and lashing it to a wooden handle with strips of bark that she softened in water and wrapped while wet, so they would shrink and tighten as they dried. The tool was crude and inefficient compared to a proper steel shovel, but it moved dirt, and that was all that mattered. She dug for hours each day, breaking soil and rock loose with her improvised shovel and carrying it out in a basket she wove from willow branches, depositing the material along the edges of the hollow where it would not be in the way. The work was agonizingly slow. A single day of effort might remove what a proper excavation team with real tools could have moved in an hour. But Clara had nothing except time and determination, and she discovered that determination could accomplish things that should have been impossible when no other option existed. By the end of May, she had expanded the sunken area by perhaps a third, deepening the floor by another 4 feet and widening the circumference to roughly 60 feet across. The breakthrough came in early June, when Clara's expanding excavation broke through into something unexpected. She had been digging at the deepest point of the pit when her improvised shovel suddenly punched through into empty space, revealing a cavity beneath the floor she had thought was solid rock. Careful exploration revealed an old mine shaft, one of dozens that honeycombed these mountains from nearly a century of coal extraction. This one apparently abandoned and forgotten long before Clara was born. The shaft extended horizontally into the hillside for perhaps 40 feet before ending at a collapsed section, but the space itself was intact. A tunnel roughly 6 feet high and 8 feet wide, dry and remarkably stable, its walls showing the marks of tools that had carved it generations ago. Clara immediately recognized what she had found, not just additional space, but temperature stability that even her sunken garden could not match. Underground temperatures in this region stayed constant at roughly 55 degrees year-round, regardless of whether the surface was baking in summer heat or freezing under winter snow. The tunnel could serve as a root cellar, a cold storage area, a frost-free space where certain crops could grow even in the dead of winter. Combined with the solar-heated sunken garden above, she now had access to 2 different climate zones, 2 different growing environments, a range of temperatures that dramatically expanded what she could cultivate. By midsummer, word had begun to spread through the surrounding communities that someone was living in the abandoned hollow at the end of Blackberry Creek. Hunters reported seeing smoke from a fire. A logging crew mentioned hearing sounds of work from somewhere up the steep ridges. The rumors were vague and sometimes contradictory, but they eventually reached the ears of an old man named Ezekiel Hawkins, who lived alone in a cabin several miles from the hollow and who had reason to be curious about anyone willing to settle in country that sensible people avoided. Ezekiel had been a farmer before the Depression had taken his land, a miner before a cave-in had crushed his leg and ended his underground career, a wanderer and odd job man for the decades since. He knew these mountains better than anyone alive, had explored every hollow and ridge during 50 years of living on their margins, and could not imagine who would voluntarily choose the remote and difficult location the rumors described. He made the trek to find out, following the creek upstream on a warm July morning, moving slowly because his damaged leg made speed impossible on rough terrain, but moving steadily because curiosity was one of the few pleasures remaining in his solitary life. He found the gap between the rock faces, followed it into the hollow, and stopped in astonishment at what he saw. The sunken garden had been transformed. What had been a natural depression was now a carefully engineered pit roughly 60 feet across and nearly 20 feet deep at its center, with terraced walls that descended in regular steps toward a floor that showed signs of intensive cultivation. Crude but functional, raised beds lined the terraces, filled with soil that someone had laboriously improved with compost and organic matter. Young plants grew in neat rows, vegetables that Ezekiel recognized, and some he did not, all of them thriving in the warm, protected environment of the pit. A rough shelter stood against the north wall, made from scavenged materials and forest debris, but showing clear signs of continuous improvement and expansion. And in the center of this improbable operation, a thin girl with dirty clothes and calloused hands looked up from her work with an expression that mixed fear and defiance in equal measure. "This is my place," Clara said, her voice steady despite her obvious alarm. "I'm not hurting anyone. I'm not taking anything that belongs to anyone else. I just want to be left alone." Ezekiel studied her for a long moment, seeing the signs of hard work and inadequate nutrition, recognizing the fierce independence that sometimes emerged from desperate circumstances. He thought about his own youth, about choices made and opportunities lost, about the years he had spent conforming to expectations that had never fit his nature. He thought about his late wife, who had died 20 years ago, and who had always said that the greatest sin was failing to help when help was needed and freely available. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said finally. "I'm here because I heard someone was living up here, and I couldn't figure out who'd be crazy enough to try." He gestured at the sunken garden, the terraces, the evidence of months of back-breaking labor. "Looks like you're not crazy at all. Looks like you know exactly what you're doing." He lowered himself onto a rock, his damaged leg grateful for the rest. "Question is, do you know what you're going to do when winter comes? Because what you've got here is impressive, but it won't keep you alive when there's 3 feet of snow on the ground and temperatures drop below zero." Clara did not answer immediately, but something in her expression shifted, the defensive hostility giving way to cautious calculation. This was not an enemy. This might be something she had not dared hope for. An ally. "I have plans," she said. I just need materials I can't make or find myself. Glass for the roof. Tools that actually work. Seeds for crops that will grow in the conditions I can create. She paused, weighing risks against potential benefits. I have food. Not a lot, but some. I could trade. Ezekiel laughed, a rusty sound that suggested laughter was not a frequent occurrence in his life. Girl, you got something worth more than food. You've got an idea that nobody else in these mountains has ever had. You show me what you're planning to do with this place, and I'll help you find what you need to do it. The partnership transformed both of their lives. Ezekiel had knowledge that Clara lacked, decades of practical experience with construction and agriculture, and the countless small skills that mountain people accumulated through lives of necessary self-reliance. Clara had vision that Ezekiel had long ago stopped allowing himself, the ability to see possibilities where he saw only obstacles, the energy and determination that his aged body could no longer provide. Together, they worked through the summer and into fall, improving the sunken garden, excavating and expanding the underground tunnel, building the infrastructure that would allow Clara to survive her first winter, and eventually to thrive in ways neither of them had initially imagined. The glass came from an abandoned church in a dying coal town 15 miles away, its windows salvageable despite years of neglect. Ezekiel knew the man who had once been the minister there, knew that the building had been abandoned to the elements rather than formally decommissioned, knew that no one would object if some of its materials found new purpose. They made 3 trips with a borrowed mule, each journey taking 2 full days, each load of glass packed carefully in straw and transported with agonizing slowness over terrain that threatened to shatter the precious cargo. The tools came from Ezekiel's own collection, implements he had accumulated over decades and no longer had the strength to use effectively, given freely to someone who would actually put them to work. Seeds came from sources Ezekiel had maintained throughout his wandering years, connections with other gardeners and farmers who traded varieties adapted to mountain conditions, heirloom strains that had been passed down through generations of families who understood that genetic diversity was survival insurance against unpredictable futures. The roof went up in October, a wooden frame covered with the salvaged church windows, angled to catch maximum winter sun while shedding snow that might otherwise accumulate and block the light. The design was not beautiful, the different sizes and shapes of windows creating a patchwork appearance that would have made any professional builder cringe. But it was functional. Sunlight passed through the glass and struck the rock walls and soil beds below, warming them. The heat radiated upward and was trapped by the glass ceiling, unable to escape back into the cold air above. The underground tunnel, connected to the sunken garden by a passage Clara had excavated through the linking rock, provided additional temperature stability, a space that stayed at 55 degrees regardless of conditions anywhere else. By November, when the first serious cold arrived, Clara had a fully functioning underground greenhouse capable of producing food throughout the winter, a facility that existed nowhere else in Appalachian West Virginia, and that most agricultural experts would have declared impossible if asked about it theoretically. The first winter was a test that Clara passed with a margin of success that surprised even her. The sunken greenhouse maintained temperatures above 40 degrees on most winter nights, dropping into the mid-30s only during the most severe cold snaps when temperatures outside plunged well below zero. The crops she had selected for winter growing thrived in these conditions. Cold, hardy greens like kale and spinach and various Asian vegetables that Ezekiel had obtained from a connection in Charleston, root vegetables that stored in the underground tunnel at perfect temperatures, herbs that provided both flavor and medicinal value. By February, Clara had more food than she could eat, surplus that Ezekiel began quietly trading in the surrounding communities for supplies that the greenhouse operation needed. The transactions were always presented as his own produce, grown in his own garden, because a 14-year-old girl living alone in the mountains would have attracted exactly the kind of attention that Clara needed to avoid. But the quality of the vegetables, their freshness in a season when most families survived on canned goods and stored roots, generated questions that Ezekiel answered vaguely, protecting Clara's privacy while building a reputation for produce that people wanted more of. Spring brought expansion, summer brought refinement, and by the second winter, Clara's operation had grown to the point where Ezekiel's fictional garden could no longer plausibly explain the quantity and variety of produce they were trading. The decision to reveal the truth was Clara's, made after long consideration of risks and benefits, and executed with the careful planning that characterized everything she did. She invited 3 women from the nearest communities to visit the hollow, choosing them carefully based on Ezekiel's knowledge of local personalities. Women who had shown kindness without expectation, who had histories of keeping confidences, who might understand what Clara had built and why she had built it in secret. The women arrived expecting to see a large garden, perhaps a particularly favorable growing site. What they found left them speechless for long minutes, standing at the edge of the sunken greenhouse and staring at the terraced beds, the glass roof, the evidence of production that seemed impossible for the location and season. Clara showed them everything, explained the principles that made it work, answered questions with the patience of someone who had thought deeply about every aspect of her creation. She showed them the underground tunnel where roots stored perfectly, the germination area where she started seeds weeks before any outdoor planting was possible, the system of thermal mass and solar gain that maintained growing temperatures without any fuel consumption whatsoever. By the end of the tour, the women were not just impressed but excited, recognizing implications that extended far beyond one girl's survival project. The communities in this region struggled with food security every winter, families surviving on monotonous diets of preserved vegetables and cured meat, children developing health problems from lack of fresh produce during the cold months. Clara had solved that problem, had developed techniques that could be replicated by anyone willing to do the work, had created a model that could transform how mountain communities fed themselves. Word spread through the 3 nearest villages with the speed of genuine hope, that rarest and most precious of commodities in communities that had learned to expect disappointment. People came to see, initially skeptical, leaving as converts to an idea that seemed obvious in retrospect, but that no one had previously attempted. Clara taught freely, sharing everything she had learned, helping others identify sites where similar greenhouses might be constructed, advising on design modifications appropriate for different locations and resources. Over the following 3 years, 11 underground greenhouses were built in the surrounding region, each one adapted to its specific site, but all following the principles Clara had developed through experimentation and observation. The impact on food security was measurable and significant. Families that had never eaten fresh vegetables between November and April now had access to produce throughout the winter. Health improved, medical costs decreased, children grew stronger. The economic impact was equally substantial. Surplus production could be sold in larger towns, providing cash income for communities that had previously survived largely on subsistence and barter. Clara's grandmother heard about the greenhouses, heard about the girl who had developed them, heard the name that people spoke with respect and gratitude. She never visited, never acknowledged what her discarded granddaughter had accomplished, never admitted that her judgment might have been wrong. She died in the winter of 1962, 8 years after she had thrown Clara out, still insisting to anyone who would listen that the girl had always been nothing but trouble. Clara attended the funeral, standing at the back of the small church, leaving before anyone could speak to her. She felt nothing that she could identify as grief, only a vague sadness for a relationship that had never been allowed to exist. For the grandmother she might have loved if love had ever been offered or welcomed. Ezekiel Hawkins died in the spring of 1965, peacefully in his sleep in the cabin where he had lived alone for so many decades. He had spent his final years happier than he had been since his wife's death, finding purpose in Clara's project and satisfaction in watching her transform from a desperate child into a confident young woman. He left Clara his cabin and his land, the first property she had ever owned, a gift that recognized the family they had become for each other when their blood families had failed them both. Clara married at 22, a young man named Joseph Blackwood who had helped build one of the community greenhouses and who saw in Clara a partner rather than a possession, an equal rather than a subordinate. They built their life together in the hollow, expanding the original greenhouse, adding living quarters, raising 3 children who grew up understanding that food security was not something to take for granted, and that determined people could accomplish things that the comfortable and complacent declared impossible. The greenhouse operation continued to expand, not because Clara sought growth, but because people kept asking for help, kept wanting to learn, kept recognizing the value of what she had discovered. By 1980, when Clara was 40 years old, there were over 40 underground greenhouses operating in the Appalachian region, all of them tracing their design principles back to the sunken pit that a desperate 14-year-old girl had expanded with an improvised stone shovel because she had no other option for survival. Agricultural researchers eventually documented Clara's work, publishing studies that introduced her techniques to audiences far beyond the mountain communities where they had originated. The publications used scientific terminology to explain principles Clara had discovered through observation, validating her methods in language that the academic world respected while adding nothing of substance to what she already knew. Clara Blackwood lived in her hollow until her death in 2019 at the age of 79, having spent 65 years in the place that her grandmother's rejection had forced her to find. Her children and grandchildren still operate the original greenhouse, still teach the techniques she developed, still feed families who might otherwise go hungry during the long mountain winters. The sunken garden that Clara dug with a stone blade has been expanded and improved over 6 decades, but its fundamental design remains unchanged, still capturing solar energy and storing it in thermal mass, still maintaining growing temperatures through the coldest weather without any external energy input. The underground tunnel that she discovered by accident now extends over 200 feet into the hillside, providing perfect storage conditions for thousands of pounds of produce that feeds not just her family, but the surrounding communities that have come to depend on the food security she created. The 3 villages that Clara's greenhouse network originally served have grown into thriving communities, their populations stable, while similar towns throughout Appalachia have declined, their economies diversified by the agricultural production that Clara made possible. The lesson of Clara Whitmore's life extends beyond agriculture or architecture or any specific technique that might be replicated elsewhere. It speaks to the human capacity for transformation, for taking rejection and using it as fuel for creation rather than destruction. Her grandmother threw her away because she was different, because she asked questions, because she wanted more than the narrow life that mountain tradition prescribed for girls. Those same qualities that made her unwelcome in her grandmother's house made her capable of building something that her grandmother's limited imagination could never have conceived. The curiosity that was called troublesome became the foundation of innovation. The wandering that was called laziness became the exploration that discovered the hollow. The reading that was called useless became the knowledge that transformed a geological accident into a year-round food production system. Everything that Clara's grandmother had criticized became essential to Clara's success. Every flaw reinterpreted as a strength when placed in a context that allowed it to flourish. So here is the question for you. What qualities in yourself have you been taught to see as flaws, as problems to be corrected, as aspects of your nature that make you less valuable or less welcome? What might those qualities become if you found a context where they could flourish? A place where your differences became advantages rather than liabilities? And what might you build if you stopped trying to shrink yourself to fit spaces designed by people who could not see your potential? Clara Whitmore was thrown away by the only family she had because she refused to be small enough to fit their expectations. She found a hollow in the mountains and built something that none of them could have imagined, something that fed communities and changed lives and proved that the qualities they had rejected were exactly what was needed to solve problems they had never thought to address. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think differently about rejection and resilience and the unexpected gifts that sometimes hide in our apparent flaws, hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things by refusing to accept the limitations others tried to impose on them. Because sometimes the greatest creations come from people who had no choice but to create, who built new worlds because the existing world had no place for who they actually were.